Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to business continuity, resilience, COVID, supply chain management, crisis management, anything that can help you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Today, we're going to talk about something that I'm a little curious about because it's a little bit different than other topics that I've talked about. We've talked about supply chain management before, but we haven't talked about supply chain security. So I'd like to welcome to the show today someone who's going to give us some insight into this, Andrew Owlett. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Alex.
Now, I know you and I have gone back and forth, and I know a little bit about you. Could you take a minute or two, though, to let our listeners around the globe know a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got into what you do?
Sure. So over the last 17 years, I've been in the broader resilience space. I started out as a first responder. I was a firefighter and EMT and got into continuity planning by way of that and training and exercise development, and then eventually pivoted out of public safety and went into consulting. Did consulting for about 7 years across healthcare, defense, national security, higher education, to name the industries. And then eventually pivoted my way into private sector tech, where I am today. And I head up global IT supply chain security for Fortune 5 company. So a lot of different pivots along the way, but my core competencies are really business continuity planning, crisis management, and then broader security elements like threat management, intel, and stuff like that.
Oh, well, great. I'm looking forward to chatting with you. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here.
You say that now, it's so early in the morning. Will you feel the same way later today?
No, not at all. If you ask me in 8 hours, I'll say I'm here.
Well, let's jump into what we're going to talk about today. Supply chain security. So what is supply chain security? Because we're always hearing supply chain management, but what is supply chain security?
Yeah, it's not to twist the words around, but it's securing the supply chain end to end. It's making sure that products and services, however they're transported physically or via the internet, are secured. So I like to think of it as on the physical side, you typically hear about, well, maybe not, raw material providers. They source and build equipment. And those pieces of equipment get shipped from point A to point B, and eventually they make their ways to the geographic region where their final destinations are. And each touch point along the way presents an insurmountable amount of risk. And making sure that you manage that, understand what it could be, put controls into place, and really get ahead of that so you don't have that's a secondary thing, putting controls into place, but really getting foresight into what those risks are is really the heart of it. And that's on the physical side. Then you have the cyber side, which is more like software like third party type of supply chain risk. And that's a little different, but making sure that where software is being developed, how it's being developed, where it's being stored, and then how it's being transferred. And of course, putting controls into place is another aspect of that as well. So physical, cyber, and it kind of comes together, and it's interesting.
Well, you touched on a couple of bits there. A lot of times when we think of supply chain, and really you hear about this and see this on the news, that it is, as you say, the physical side of things. Mm-hmm. But if I'm understanding you correctly, it's also the technology side of things, the cyber. It's not just the physical product, here's a roll of steel, for a plant, but it's also the electronic stuff and technical expertise that gets delivered.
For sure. And actually, before I touch on that, it's interesting. You just brought up another point, and that's the news. Look, we're 2 minutes into this or 3 minutes into this, and we're already going down a tangent. Alex, you warned me about this.
See, I told you, I always go off script.
You did. The news is really interesting. Like one of the things, let me take a massive step back and kind of like explain my team construct, because I think that'll give some really good context here. So effectively today we have 4 pillars on my team. We have a real-time threat intelligence component, which is effectively like a radar scanning the horizon, trying to catch the next disruption. That's one piece. The second piece is a business continuity piece, business continuity with suppliers, and then within we have an internal fulfillment network within that as well. It's all kind of interconnected there. The third piece is an investigations component, really looking at under the surface, who are we working with? How are we working with them? What type of data do we transfer back and forth? What type of products do we get? Stuff like that. And then the fourth piece is more of like a cyber risk piece. And that's taking those investigations, taking that real-time threat intelligence, taking that business continuity and tying it together to provide some sort of supplier cyber common operating picture. So the reason I mention all of that is because you mentioned news, and news is so hard to weed through, like on the surface. Like I think I like to describe the news as it's a great like outreach tool when it's accurate. But when it's not, the misinformation and combing through that is really hard for an ordinary person to comb through, especially when you're getting like multiple different news sources mentioning the same thing. So I have dedicated tech and I have a dedicated resource to look at that and comb through the misinformation so we can pivot based on the best information we have. Now, those signals that we get come from different angles. They come from the news, they come from our suppliers, they come from our procurement team. There's a lot of different things there, but piecemealing that together to provide like one intel picture effectively is extremely important. The news, like just on the surface, may not do that. So,
So the other thing I want us to touch on is you mentioned putting controls in place, both for physical and for technology, cyber. Who puts them in place? Because it's got me thinking, company ABC is my supplier. I see all these risks. I need to put controls in place, mitigation factors along the way. But ABC's supplier may just say, well, I don't care what you do. Here it is. I'm just sending it to you. Or they may have their own set. So who puts those in place, and how do you validate that those controls along that path work?
That is the million-dollar question. It's a really important one, because at the end of the day, we live in a world where we still have some archaic business practices of handshakes and verbal agreements. And I say that because across the board in business, that happens. And unfortunately, when the rubber hits the road, not having anything in writing is one of the worst things. I think we actually may have seen this in the last 2 years, and we're still seeing some of it now with semiconductor constraints. A lot of companies have struggled to get semiconductors because of the contraction and advancement of like tech during the beginnings of COVID until now. And the output in production just could not like increase rapidly enough to meet consumer demand. And now it's catching up, but people are purchasing less, and we're going into a recession, allegedly 50 to 70% chance of it. But anyway, that's a rant for another time. My point is having legal controls up front and center is extremely important, because if you don't have that, if you don't have the boundaries set, and if you don't put in to your legal documentation how you're going to assess supplier capabilities and what expectations are, you're not going to get anywhere. Now, some suppliers won't accept the terms, because when you start digging into a supplier's supply chain, there's a lot of proprietary stuff that they just don't want to give the keys to the kingdom away.
Mhm.
So getting around that is interesting, and I'm still working through a lot of this, to be honest, because it can be challenging. When you get two legal entities together and they say, we want to do this, we don't want to do this, and you have to figure out a way to meet in the middle. So some of the ways that folks do meet in the middle is through more of a self-assessment route. That's okay, but it's heavily biased.
Mm.
It's whatever you decide to kind of grade yourself. I mean, it's how you interpret the definitions and the scoring and everything. It's not very subjective. It's very objective, is what I'm trying to say. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, do you share that information? Because if you're doing two partners both doing self-assessments, like, kind of, how do you bring them together?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So it depends. I hate that. I hate saying it depends, but sometimes it's one-sided. So if you have somebody that's a purchaser purchasing equipment from a supplier, and the purchaser wants to understand the supplier's capabilities, it's a one-way type of dialogue. But as we know, in any world, you need to kind of have a give and take. You need to be able to lend a hand, ask for something, lend a hand. Like it's never a one-way dialogue. So sharing it hasn't historically went too well, to be honest. I'm not going to sit here and say it's all pretty and it's all working out. But when you want to be the receiver of information and you're asking, and it doesn't always work. So but the exchange of information, it can be as simple as going into a simple user interface and entering information, or having like some sort of automatic like API hooked up where you're reaching into a supplier system to get information and pump it back to you, so you can understand in real time their capabilities and they're scored on it. So there are different ways to kind of do it, manual versus automatic.
What if, because you talked about the self-assessments there, and we mentioned bringing them together. What if the self-assessments are looking at different things? Because obviously, as a purchaser, I'm looking at things through a specific lens and a specific perspective. As a seller, I have a different lens and a different perspective. So even though we may be doing two self-assessments, that, as you say, are probably going to be biased. Hey, we're great. Yeah, we're great too. But what if they are literally focusing on two different things?
I'd say
One
that's
sees something as a risk, and one says, no, there isn't a risk.
Yeah, I'd say that number one, I think that's the norm. That you'll get you'll get that, and I think that's the importance of weeding through some of the data when you get it. It's not always the most accurate on the surface, but one of the things, I mean, there are different ways that at least I found helpful to navigate this. And it all foundationally starts with relationships. Like our legal teams kind of are the front line to this, but if for whatever reason they're not, then our procurement teams are kind of like right there tied to the hip, because we're making a purchase, and that's an entry point to do that. And they're also the negotiators, the contract negotiators, and then hand it over to legal. They're also the readiness, the supplier readiness group, to make sure that suppliers can meet demand and constrict or contract when we need them to.
Mhm.
And the list goes on and on. But typically those procurement teams have scorecards that they're looking at the capabilities of the supplier on an ongoing basis, on a quarterly basis. And as capabilities change, that information in real time or on a quarterly basis can be pumped to the security team so they can see. there was an unauthorized data exposure here, like as an example, that's on the cyber side, but that crosses into supply chain security right off the bat.
Yeah.
And we didn't find out about it for 2 weeks. We're supposed to know about it in 24 hours. And that's like a performance issue. That's a compliance issue. That's a security issue. That's a legal issue. That's a lot of things. So anyway, it's interesting when you start peeling stuff back and you start connecting the dots and bringing all the relationships together. And that's what my function does. It brings everybody together to tell one story, because you often don't have that. You have like 40, 50 different stories, and it's hard to keep track.
On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We're talking with Andrew Owlett today about supply chain security, and we will be right back. If you like that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.